Welcome back, everybody, to the Denver Dzogchen podcast. I'm here once again with Joe Wagner, and we are continuing our new series on the Ngondro, the inner Ngondro. And we gave our introduction last time, and this time we're going to go into the first of the 5 main activities of Ngondro, the refuge. And this one's so crucial. Refuge is entering Buddhism, right? It's really like becoming a Buddhist is to take refuge. So Joe, maybe you can unpack a little bit about this whole what does refuge even mean? Are we, you know, is this like accepting Jesus as our savior? Are we becoming a Buddhist, but in that way? What does it mean to take refuge?
Hello, Damien. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. I think some of these things are glossed over. The whole Ngondro, outer Ngondro, people don't even think about it, like we talked about previously. And then inner Ngondro, it mostly looks like numbers, accumulation, which actually still works. Doing it at any level is still good. And I encourage everyone to do the Ngondro who's interested in Vajrayana. Your experience of Vajrayana will be deeper. And when you go see a teacher you've not met before, when they say, as they very frequently do, well, have you completed the Ngondro? You can say, yes, or I'm working on it, not, I don't need to do that. Okay. Anyway, that's my experience of traditional teachers. But I'm happy to talk about this stuff and happy to share my own limited insights. What is refuge? Why is refuge important? All of Buddhism says, I take refuge in the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, in the Sangha, in the refuge within myself. All this thing is common to all schools. So it must be important. But oftentimes, as you funnily said about inviting Jesus into our lives, it is a little different than that. And unless it's explained or unless it's talked about, people think, well, okay, I've got to do this Ngondro. It's a huge number, which it is. So mostly I just got to get prostrating and just recite this thing. Now, of course, this thing being the 4-line or 8-line or 16-line refuge formula that fits with whichever Ngondro the person is doing from that lineage. I think it's good to think about what we are actually doing. We are already, as humans, taking refuge all the time. We are experts at taking refuge, and we take refuge in all sorts of things. We take refuge in the true existence of ourself. That's the fundamental fault, according to the Dharma, and causes all of our problems. We take refuge in the sense of, I'm over here and the world's over there, this dualistic kind of framework, which is what is attempted to be overturned through the practice of the Dharma. We take refuge in all kinds of outer things, in our relationship, with our partner, with our children, in our jobs, refuge in our homes, refuge in our bicycle, or whatever. We are continuously putting our refuge out there, and in doing that, we are taking refuge in samsara. Taking refuge in samsara grants the boon, the outcome of great suffering, because the nature of things is that they are impermanent. This was so important that that was the final statement of the Buddha himself. When he passed away, his last words were, decay is inherent in all compounded things. Strive on with diligence. This is one translation, the one that I think to myself. If we are busy taking refuge in compounded things which have as their mechanism of action impermanence and decay, we are guaranteed not only to deepen our commitment to confusion and suffering, but also to trap ourselves every day more deeply in an experience that is unpleasant. It is not that we weren't taking refuge and now we're going to start. It's that we were taking the wrong refuge. And so we're going to swap out, in a sense, or wear away at our tendency to take refuge in compounded things and take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma and in the Sangha, and for Vajrayanists, in the Guru as the unification of all of those. I think it's worth considering, like, what is the Buddha that we're taking refuge in? What is the Dharma? What are they talking about? If we don't know that, no matter how much we say it, it doesn't go that deep, and it isn't as applicable. We can't apply it when we, leave our shrine room where we are doing our prostrations and so forth. And as we said before, oftentimes refuge is combined with physical prostrations, the full prostration where your body's this way, prostrating this way, and you bow down until you're prone, and then you get up, all the time saying the refuge formula, sometimes also combined with bodhicitta verses. But we're going to talk about them individually since that's more common, and it's also easier to understand. So far, does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, it reminds me, and the word refuge, it's a little unfamiliar to us in English, I think. And Trungpa Rinpoche, he famously said, we're a refugee, right? It's like coming from a war-torn country of samsara, and we're coming to this place of the Dharma as a new country we can take haven in. When he said that, that clicked for me. Like, oh, okay, now I see what refuge means. It's like what we rely on for protection, for guidance, for what our idea of truth is. So we're shifting what we rely on, because just as you said, we rely on supplements and food to keep us alive forever. We rely on our bank account. We rely on our job. We rely on our car. We rely on our relationships. And all of these things are guaranteed to fail us. And so why are we relying on things that will fail? So what won't fail us? And Buddhism's contention is that the three jewels and the guru are reliable refuges. They will not fail us. We can trust them. And so maybe you can speak a little bit more as to why we can trust these things.
Very nicely said. And I love that about refugee. I had forgotten that. I like that so much. We are refugees. We are wandering in a world of uncertainty. And when we put our refuge in compounded phenomena, which on some level we know cannot last. If you just take your relationship as an example, even the best relationship still ends at death. Even if you die together, which is pretty unusual, you still are going to have parting there and so forth. We all know that. So that refuge, whether it's in relationship or your job or your body or whatever, your legacy, any of this stuff, is an anxiety-producing situation. You know in your heart it can't really last, yet you're going to pretend that it's going to last, and you're going to put all your hopes in it. It's like, it's like walking on ice. You know it's going to give way, but you don't know exactly when. Can I get halfway across? Could I possibly make it all the way across this lake? It's a very anxiety-producing situation. And our goal in Dharma practice is to reduce our anxiety. And one way to do that is swapping out our refuge in something that we know in our heart is not reliable to something more reliable, something that we can gain real anxiety-free joy from, and so forth. And the first thing there is the Buddha. Now, oftentimes this is kind of explained, even when you see the refuge tree, because when you do these practices, you visualize in front of you a great big tree, and it's got all the lineage masters, and in the center for Nyingmas, it's usually Guru Padmasambhava, who's, inseparable from your own teacher, and so forth. Different people in the center for different traditions. But the thing is, you've got all the masters in front of you. And when you're taking refuge, we often think we're taking refuge in Padmasambhava or in Shakyamuni Buddha or whatever. This is not 100% correct, at least not from the perspective of Dzogchen. And since this is Denver Dzogchen podcast, and we can talk about a little bit about Dzogchen, we take refuge outwardly in the Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, or the second Buddha, Guru Padmasambhava, or our own teacher, whatever, as an external person, but only as an example of what's possible. There is some benefit in saying, like, oh, Pelka Orjin, or whoever you love, oh, your holiness, the Dalai Lama, I take refuge in you. Of course, there's some value in that. But the Dalai Lama is still a temporary being, right? He's in his body now, and we pray that he stays in his body forever. But knowing that most people tend to die and they don't live to be 250 years old, again, there's some anxiety there. So from a Dzogchen perspective, from an Nyingma perspective, I should say, and I imagine this is the same for other lineages, although all the Ngondros I've done have been from the Nyingma perspective, we see in the guru the manifestation or the outward appearance of our own ultimate nature, our own primordial awareness. And when we unify those, and then we can call that Padmasambhava, or we can call that Buddha Shakyamuni, or we can call that Samantabhadra, whatever. Then when we look like we're taking refuge outwardly toward the form of the Buddha, we're really taking refuge inwardly into that aspect of our minds which never changes, which is impossible to be separate from, which is one with what we really are, so to speak, just in a general terms. And this is really important to keep in mind when you're making the prostrations. Of course, you're visualizing the refuge tree, and in the center of the refuge tree is whoever is the primary figure of your Ngondro you're doing. But when you're really bowing down, what are you bowing down to? Your own inner nature. This is very, very powerful. This is a very big switch. And it's a fundamental change in how we relate to the world. It makes the real refuge something we already have. We don't have to get it from elsewhere. We don't have to please someone for it. We don't have to imagine it or pray to it as much as we need to recognize it. And this is the fundamental Dzogchen orientation toward all the refuges, but it's very important to have it shown or talked about. Otherwise, you really do get in this thing like, oh yeah, when I grew up, I was a Catholic, so I took refuge in Jesus. Now I'm swapping Jesus out and he's got a hat on and his name is Guru Rinpoche. Okay, that is actually not what's going on here. It's much more profound and much more subtle.
Yeah, I think it's so important you say that. Recently I heard Garchen Rinpoche being as scoldy as I've ever heard Garchen Rinpoche being about him saying, stop taking refuge in my body. He said, that's not who I really am. You're taking refuge in my mind, which is inseparable from your mind. And I think this is really important because when I began the Ngondro, there was definitely a lot of like, I'm taking refuge in something outside of me. That was part of what I was doing. And that caused me to, over the years, have times where I lost faith, where I thought, well, these are compounded things too. I'm not Tibetan, and these beings are not going to be able to literally show up and save me when I'm dying. So what am I taking refuge in? And not until I really fused that Dzogchen understanding with those beings and realizing that the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and Lama are all nothing other than our own nature, that it really is a reliable refuge, that it really is something I know I can rely on and will never leave me even when I die. Because that was a big concern for me. It's like, well, if I'm not able to lucid dream and take these practices into my dreams, then how can I rely on the moment of death that they'll follow me? But if I know that my true nature is what I'm really taking refuge in, then that's not something I can be separated.
I like that you said that. Thank you. And you also gave all of us a picture of the potential transformation that can take place through doing these practices. You said, as I heard you, when you started, you were taking refuge in the outer form of Padmasambhava or Shakyamuni, whatever. And as you went along, it fused, I like this, it fused with your understanding, your developing understanding of your own nature, and you realized that you actually weren't taking refuge outwardly. This is a key point and little sales pitch for the Ngondro itself. We are transforming. Vajrayana is the path of transformation ultimately, even though they say Dzogchen is not, really about transformation, but about recognition. It's still part of the greater Vajrayana sphere. And because of that, we can see that the Dharma does not change, but we are changing in our understanding, in our appreciation, in our ability to relax. When you start, of course, you're taking refuge outwardly because that's the only thing we know how to do. We've always done that. take refuge in our parents from day one, in our mother primarily. And then later we stop taking refuge in our parents so much and we start to take refuge in our girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. And then if we keep going, we turn that into a refuge in a wife or husband or whatever. These are all outward things. And even no matter how subtle you make those, if they're outside, then they're for sure not very reliable. So that anxiety can't leave us. But even in the process of just the refuge, the first part of the Ngondro, you start to experience that it's not really outside. Not only in a psychological sense that, the visualization's still in my mind, I'm not really imagining, not so much that, not only that, although that is also sometimes part of it, but you start to actually feel that what you are taking refuge in is what you actually are. It's a very profound shift. And I think that's hard to do if you skip these practices. So here's a little Ngondro advertisement in the middle of this. But you're absolutely right that the real refuge has to be already with us. If we have to get it from elsewhere, then it can also leave us. Because just like I have this nail file, if I get it from outside, eventually it will not be with me anymore. And that's the same with this body and everything else. And that is an anxiety-producing situation. In order to overcome this tendency toward anxiety, we do these practices while keeping the view, which is usually shown to us in the beginning, as it was to you, that the real refuge is inside. The real refuge is what never changes. And that is, when you begin to understand that, some levels of that built-in anxiety can start to leave us. And then the real change, by taking refuge in this way, in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, Guru, we actually become the refuge, and then we're able to benefit others in a much more profound way. And I think this is shown exactly in what you said about Garchen Rinpoche. What a beautiful teaching. What gratitude we can have for someone saying, I'm not my body. Don't take refuge in my body, especially as he's 86 or 87 this year. And as much as we pray he will stay forever, he probably won't. And that prepares us for that. And we take refuge not in the physical form, but in that which is also one with us. And that's very, very important. And also a way to let go of all the stress that comes from such an unpredictable world. So nicely said. I liked how you said that.
Yeah, and that points back to what I said on the last episode, where I was saying how Ngondro really all is Guru Yoga. Well, that's what that means. Fusing, what is yoga? One way of talking about this, fusing our own mind with the Lama's mind. And so what that also means is we are fusing our refuge with our own nature, where we're taking refuge is the same as unifying. We're unifying with our own nature instead of bifurcating everything. Everything is split, everything is broken. And this is unification, that we're going through this process of taking our projections and bringing them back into our nature. And if we can do the Ngondro from that point of view, because I've done more Ngondro practice since even completing my first round. And when you can do it really where you are understanding that you're taking refuge in your true nature while doing your prostrations, that's a whole different practice. You really can feel something different happens. This shift can happen where you're like, it's more like rejoicing in something than it is getting something you didn't already have. And that can really be a powerful, and yet, as you're saying, Ngondro is precisely designed to set up this progression that we start to re-own and unify with what we've always already had, but somehow lost track of.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, the Vajrayana is extremely clever. Buddhism generally is very smart, and you just have to, it is easy to see how intelligently it's put together and how magically all the parts fit together. And from a Dzogchen perspective, it's even more profound, I guess, in the sense that the way that Dzogchen is taught these days most frequently is that soon after meeting the teacher, you're given the pointing out instructions, the direct introduction to your own nature. Then every practice after that, outer Ngondro, inner Ngondro, Yidam practice, Tsalong, and all the Dzogchen stuff, all are about experiencing that more and more deeply. This is very, very profound. It's it's we're beginners, right? We're beginners, no matter where we are on the path. Unless you can put your hand make a handprint in stone, you're still a beginner, as far as I'm concerned. And it's very it's extremely special to have this opportunity, to have these numbers. Like if they just said, okay, just say the refuge and make prostrations, how much would we really do it? But when they say, do it 100,000 times, the number is so large that at some point your resistance starts to break down no matter what. And you start to have this experience that you're not going to somewhere else for refuge. You are actually expressing what you really are in taking the refuge. It's amazing. It's an amazing experience to have it occur. And the fact is that because of our orientation with, the way our eyes are and our physical bodies are and our general separation from our environment at a physical and psychic level too, we are always taking refuge. And what this is shifting that refuge. We're shifting it from the impermanent, pain-inducing, anxiety-producing situation that we always are in to one of greater degree of relaxation, of acceptance, of letting be how things already are, how they always were, which is shown to us in the very beginning of the path by the Lama, frequently these days. But we get this opportunity again and again. Oh, I've been taking refuge again in this painful, wrong refuge. I'm going to switch to something permanent. Permanent's a little funny word, but something that doesn't change. And that goes to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, Guru. It's all in a sense, the same. And by doing it at this outer level, inner more level, and body, speech, mind level, and so forth as the Ngondro progresses, then we really get an opportunity to relax in a deeper and deeper way and to be, as Dzogchen proclaims, whole, complete. Dzogchen is often translated as the great perfection, maybe better as complete wholeness, completion, in a sense. And that completion is shown to us in the beginning, but since we operate from a completely fragmented view, we have to reconnect with it over and over. And every time we say the refuge vow, make the prostration, we are again taking our hand off of the electrified fence of suffering and samsara and putting it somewhere else, into that which is already free. And this is like a key point that is not explained all the time when you do the Ngondro. And then it becomes more about like, get those numbers done, which is really selling yourself short in a sense.
But it has this benefit. We live in the desire realm, and one characteristic of us as humans is that we're always seeking. We're grasping, looking, searching, seeking. It is an addiction of ours. And in some ways, I think the Ngondro burns that out, right? Like it's like this. There's a kind of principle in some of the body mechanic, like Rolfing and stuff, where you can't release attention until you increase it first. Right. So one way to release a chronic tension is you tighten it tighter, and then you can really know what it means to let it go. And in some ways, I think Ngondro does that, right? Like we do it a little tighter, we're grasping and scraping and seeking, and we do it for 100,000 times so that we can finally let go. And that in some ways the completion stage works that way too. But it's like this chronic think. You use mantras or whatever to exacerbate this chronic tension that we have so that we can finally experience the release and be satisfied with the release because we're so addicted to this cycle.
In some ways, that's absolutely correct, I think. Since the refuge is the first part, and it's usually that which is connected with the prostrations, which are, for most people, at least Westerners, the most difficult part of the Ngondro. I think this is quite funny, considering that Westerners are 100% into exercise. I mean, I don't know a single person who doesn't do some kind of forced physical exercise, which many people in the world would think was like a torture thing. But when it comes to prostrations, we don't want to do it. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But by because the Ngondro has these stages and they get progressively more subtle, having the prostrations right at the beginning can be very valuable for us because it takes everything. Right? It takes everything. If you're like I am, I'm in Denver. It's a mile high here. There's not a lot of air. You start to make prostrations, you feel it pretty quick. And you can't do anything except be 100% focused. So it is similar to what you're talking about. It is an aspect of that is like it takes everything and you have to increase that tension. Everything else is a little bit excluded because it takes so much to do it. To do 1,000 prostrations a session is hard. Now it's funny because Tibet in general is much higher, but I have been in Tibet and I've seen young people doing the prostrations and my God, are they going fast. I think they do 4,000 or 5,000 prostrations a day. Not uncommon at all. Whipping them out. I mean, like crazy. Now, this may be just my experience of seeing people doing it. It's certainly better to do it in a little bit more mindful state for people like us. But the fact that it takes so much energy forces you to be 100% focused. So we've talked now a little bit about refuge in the Buddha, but I want to cover these other aspects. And then there are a few small things if we have time to talk about with the prostrations themselves, but we may visit that in the next session if we don't have time.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is a powerful thing. People have often probably heard the Dzogchen instructions, which is something like plopping down after a hard day of labor,
Mm.
or relax an old man in the sun, right? Because after a long and hard life, I think in some ways Ngondro helps us do that too. So it really can help if we already have received Dzogchen teachings, it can help us immediately in those practices because we have a hard time letting go. We have a hard time relaxing. But if you really do something intense with your body, speech, and mind, then when you relax, it can go a lot deeper.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially in when you're combining the prostrations with the refuge, you are combining your body, speech, and mind all together. You got the visualization going on, that's the mind part. You got the physical movement, and that's the prostration part. And then you're saying the refuge formula, and that's the speech part. And so it brings all the parts of us together, undetaches us from these painful refuges, and allows us to relax both in the moment and at the completion of each day of practice, uh, release some of that tension and have a more physical experience of being completely present, which is, of course, a major aspect of the practice of Dzogchen itself. So when we think we've talked a little bit about refuge in the Buddha, which is not really refuge in the Buddha out there somewhere, but refuge in our own Buddha nature, which is a fully accomplished Buddha. We just have to purify our obscurations, keeping us from experiencing that and increasing, get enough merit that we can fully live from that place. But what about the Dharma? Now, what is the Dharma? Dharma is the law, the word, the teachings of the Buddha. Again, we are taking refuge right now in a kind of Dharma, maybe a small d Dharma. It's the Dharma of this world. It's the Dharma that in order to get ahead, other people have to be behind. And that's just the nature of the world we're in. It's a competitive universe, and doesn't matter at what level of experience you are. For humans, it's true at, all the way from the beginning of school, right? All the way in our career. Who's the best doctor in town? It's a competition going on there, right? And even in the world of animals, outside of my meditation hut, I have a bird feeder, and the birds try to poke each other's eyes out every moment with their beaks so that they can get the food and the other birds can't get it. Now, this is all a kind of it's the law, the Dharma with a small d of the world. Now we're trying to change again, take our refuge, which has been in that type of Dharma, into a greater Dharma, the word of the Buddha, the word of the teacher, that which brings liberation as opposed to that which creates more separation. So that's the refuge in the Dharma from a certain angle, is we're retraining ourselves not to have as our only orientation the law of this world, but the higher or more profound or more freeing law that the Buddha brought to our world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. It's really the eight worldly concerns, right? The pleasure and fame and all of these things, which all can be boiled down to hope and fear, right? Like there's just this hope of success is really what we take refuge in. And it's just really a faulty refuge. And that we can really find that we can take refuge in something we already have that's reliable and stable and isn't dependent on chance or
Isn't
karma.
You're exactly right. I mean, the whole, as one of my teachers frequently says, the movement of progression or the progression of Dharma, the movement of ourselves on the path is one from Shenwang to Rangwang. Shen means external, outer. Wang means power, means being under the power of external phenomena. Rangwang, under our own power or autonomous. And the movement toward autonomy is the movement of going from being a regular samsaric being to being a true Dharma practitioner. And that, as we do that, as we become more autonomous, we become a refuge for others, which is part of the Mahayana path. It isn't only for us. Every prostration you do, it's not just so I can, purify my channels and I can see things more purely and I can be less dependent. It's for all beings in that sense.
Yeah, and then that doesn't even have to happen only at the end when you become a perfectly enlightened Buddha. You immediately start benefiting those around you. The more open, relaxed, and loving and kind you become, the more you're benefiting everybody you're connected to, and then in a butterfly effect sort of sense, everyone in the world right
Absolutely.
away.
Probably even more profoundly than that. Garchen Rinpoche teaches the Tonglen practice, the giving and taking practice, which we should have a little podcast on sometimes because it's so profound, as not only sucking out some energetic suffering of others and giving them our bliss, but by entering a state of contemplation, a state of openness, we actually benefit them right then because all our minds are the same. We all have the same orientation. And when we change ours, we also change theirs in a profound way. That seems to be really true, but not to go there. So we talked about Buddha, we talked about Dharma, talked about Sangha. Sangha means community. And our community may not just be like we have our own little Dzogchen community, our little Denver Dzogchen community, but all the communities you're part of, both Dharma related and then non-Dharma related. We're all a series of Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams is like, I'm this circle and I overlap with this circle and I overlap with that circle and all connected in that way. When we think about Sangha, we think there are many different levels, right? There's the Sangha of our immediate people who received instructions from the same master at the same time with, or empowerment. That's like intimate Sangha. Then there's, all the Buddhists in the world. Oh, hey, we all have the same orientation. This kind of thing. We could even make a distinction between spiritual people, whatever that means, and non-spiritual people, as if those people existed, or between humans and animals. There's a lot of different distinctions that can be made. I like to encourage our group and everyone who I communicate with about these things to try to see that all beings want the same thing. They all want to be happy. They all want to have their wishes fulfilled and stay away from trouble. And that, in a sense, that's just not just humans. I have, birds and squirrels, the same thing. From that perspective, we're all on the same side of the table. We are all part of the same Sangha. I think this is really crucial. Otherwise, you get this, you have this, our tendency as humans is to be like, yeah, well, there's us and them. And that can even be within your own immediate spiritual community, which is terrible, a wrong view. Very important to recognize, hey, in a not even in an ultimate sense, just in a very basic sense, we're all on the same side of the table. And anything I do to relieve the suffering of myself and others relieves the suffering of all beings and is the correct kind of orientation. So when we're prostrating, when we're making ourselves take refuge, we're taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Outer Sangha is all beings. Then there are continuously more inner sanghas. That's one side of the equation. The other side is to think that there are really two types of beings in our world. And those are those who have really entered the true path, meaning they've reached the first bhumi. They're real bodhisattvas. They've seen the truth. They've entered the path of seeing. These are all the same thing. They constitute what's called the Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha. And that is our real refuge when we think I take refuge in the Sangha. We're not only taking refuge in all beings, we're taking refuge in those who have transcended a state of ordinary confusion to some level and are at that point enlightened. They say that anybody who's on the first bhumi of the 10 bhumis or the 13 bhumis, or depends on the system, is enlightened in comparison to ordinary beings. So I think it's important to recognize there's a distinction there. There are beings of which we're all members of the same Sangha, whether we call ourselves Catholics or atheists or Buddhists or Dzogchen people or whatever. But inside of all those beings, there are those who have actually accomplished the path to some degree. Beings like Garchen Rinpoche, His Holiness, these people who are quite obviously amazing. They no longer think of themselves in the same way that I think of myself. Those are the true refuge from the perspective of when we take refuge in the Sangha. We're really taking refuge in the Arya Sangha.
Yeah. So we're going through all of this, and the refuge tree embodies all of these refuges, right? So we're working to unify our minds, shifting away from the eight worldly concerns to this new refuge. We're literally, visualizing ourselves in this pure land where the ground is holy and enlightening in the trees. We're shifting our allegiance through all of these mechanisms of prostration, visualization, and saying the refuge prayer. We're starting to put ourselves on this new land. We're being refugees in this new land where we can feel we can rely on what we're now taking refuge in. And this is really the first step of Ngondro, right? We're shifting our allegiance from samsara
well said.
to the Dharma.
I think you not only the first step, but the final step too. Yeah. It is about changing our allegiance. I'm so glad you brought that up. And maybe this is how we should conclude our session. We can finish up with other things, the rest of this in our next session. But right now, our allegiance is entirely to samsaric values, and that all is based on this dualistic idea that I'm over here and everything else over there. When you receive the initial introduction, if you have a successful experience of that, so to speak, then you come to see that things are quite different than you thought. And you have this new opportunity on some level to begin to change your allegiance from this samsaric view of everything being us and them to something much more profound and deep. The view or rigpa or whatever you want to call that. That which is essential to all beings, to the entire world, in fact. And this process of changing our allegiance is the very foundation of the path. And it's shown very concretely and directly in the Ngondro practices. We're changing our refuge. I'm taking refuge in my samsaric environment. Now I'm going to take refuge in the holy ones, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, Guru. I have an orientation where I'm the only really important thing in the universe. I'm changing my allegiance to a view of bodhicitta, which we'll talk about next time. And it's the same for all of these practices. And in fact, it's the actual foundation of the path of Dzogchen itself. You're changing your allegiance from your samsaric mind of confusion to the ultimate nature. And that allegiance change is something we're doing every time we sit down, really, if we're real practitioners, as frequently as possible, maybe even every minute, every hour, whatever. And that, I think that's crucial. This is all about just changing our allegiance.
Building a new habit, because we are built on habits, and we have the habit of taking refuge in samsara. So now we're going to build the habit of taking refuge in the Dharma. And this is really what Ngondro is all about, and the whole path is really all about. So I want to thank all of you once again for listening to our podcast, watching our podcast. As always, please like, share, subscribe. All those things helps us out a lot. We really appreciate you. When we'll be back next time to talk about bodhicitta, continue talking about Ngondro. And if there's anything you want to hear from us, please feel free to comment or get in touch with us through the website, denverdzogchen.com. And thank you so much, and have a great day.